What if one of the great scientific discoveries about Neanderthals was not a discovery at all, but a return to an older prejudice dressed up in modern language? What if the story that Neanderthals vanished because their brains were inferior was never really proven, never really measured in a fair way, and never really separated from the deep old habit of imagining them as almost human, but not quite human enough? That is the uncomfortable question now sitting behind a new paper on Neanderthal brains, because the most startling thing about its conclusion is not that it is radical. It is that it should not be startling at all. Almost 40 years before this new study, Ralph Holloway, one of the most important scholars in the study of fossil brains, had already warned that the so-called poor brain of Homo sapiens neanderthalensis was largely a projection, a story people were telling themselves from the outside of a skull, from the shape of a brow ridge, from the expectation that a different-looking human must have had a lesser mind. In 1985, Holloway was already saying that Neanderthal brains did not show primitive features in size, convolutional pattern, asymmetry, or complexity. He was already saying that Neanderthals had brains at least as large as ours, probably highly competent, probably language-capable, and probably judged unfairly by a museum culture still struggling to free itself from the image of the ape-like caveman. And yet that warning did not win the public story. The stereotype came back. It returned with a new accent, a new vocabulary, and a new scientific backdrop. It no longer had to speak in the old language of brutish cavemen dragging clubs across the Ice Age. It could speak instead of globular skulls, parietal expansion, executive function, symbolic behavior, demographic replacement, and the cognitive superiority of modern humans allegedly coming out of Africa. But underneath the polished terminology, the emotional structure was the same. Neanderthals were still being made into the defeated other. They were still the ones who did not quite have what we had. They were still the population that failed the test of modernity, and modern humans were still presented as the victorious species whose mind was somehow sharper, more flexible, more symbolic, and more socially advanced. The story had changed its clothes, but not always its skeleton. The new study forces us to look at that skeleton. Researchers compared the estimated regional brain differences between Neanderthals and early modern humans against something very simple and very revealing: variation among living humans. They examined data sets from 100 ethnic Han Chinese individuals and 100 Americans of European ancestry, and the result was devastating for the old assumption. In nearly 70% of the brain regions assessed, the volume differences between these two living human groups were larger than the differences previously estimated between Neanderthals and early modern humans. That does not mean Chinese people and European Americans have meaningfully different levels of intelligence. No serious scientist would use that conclusion. The point is exactly the opposite. If living human populations can show regional brain volume differences of this scale without being treated as separate cognitive species, then similar or smaller differences between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens cannot be used casually as evidence that Neanderthals were mentally inferior. That is the quiet bomb hidden inside the finding. For decades, many researchers looked at the contrast between Neanderthal skulls and modern human skulls and treated shape as destiny. Neanderthal skulls were long and low with projecting faces, heavy brow ridges and large nasal openings. Early modern human skulls were rounder, more globular, with smaller faces tucked beneath a different cranial vault. The difference was real. Nobody has to deny the anatomy, but the leap from skull shape to mind has always been the dangerous part. A skull is not a transcript of thought. An endocranium, the inner cast of the skull, can preserve clues about the surface form of the brain, but it does not preserve memories, grammar, kinship systems, myths, jokes, planning ability, grief, or the capacity to teach a child how to survive winter. It gives us shadows, not the mind itself, and the temptation has always been to fill those shadows with whatever story the age already wanted to believe. Holloway understood this problem long before it became fashionable. His 1985 paper was not written like a timid technical note. Even the title had an edge to it. The Poor Brain of Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, See What You Please. The title alone almost gives away the accusation. Holloway was saying that people were not simply seeing Neanderthal brains, they were seeing what they had already decided to see. They were looking at the ancient skull and finding in it a familiar script: large teeth, broad nose, heavy brow, primitive mind. He pointed out that Neanderthals had been burdened by what he called nasty slurs and insults, from claims about rickets and disease to arguments about limited language and evolutionary inferiority. He noted that popular images had placed them somewhere between human and beast, while even scientific reconstructions sometimes made them into lumbering half-creatures, frozen forever beneath the weight of their brow ridges. But when Holloway turned from stereotype to measurement, the picture changed. The Neanderthal brain was not small. In fact, depending on the sample, Neanderthal cranial capacities were often large, and sometimes larger on average than those of many modern human samples, and the numbers did not support a simple story of a small-brained, primitive being, even above most average estimates for modern Europeans. The point was not that Neanderthals were therefore superior. The point was that brain size could not be used honestly to make them inferior. Holloway also saw that the usual escape route did not work. When large Neanderthal brain size became impossible to deny, some researchers tried to move the argument away from size and toward organization. Perhaps the brain was large but badly arranged. Perhaps it was big because of cold adaptation, big because of body mass, big because of visual demands, but not big in the right places. Holloway did not dismiss every possible difference. He was not pretending that Neanderthals and modern humans were anatomically identical, but he insisted that the evidence did not justify confident claims of primitive organization. He examined asymmetries, convolutional patterns, and endocast features, and he found no clear basis for treating Neanderthal brains as primitive. He argued that if one were judging Neanderthals only by stone tool technology, then modern hunter-gatherers with stone tools could also be misjudged in the same crude way, as if material simplicity in one category proved mental simplicity. That was the trap, confusing archaeological survival with cognitive capacity. This was especially important because, by the 1980s, the crudest caveman caricature had been weakened. Researchers had begun to see Neanderthals as more human, more competent, more culturally complex than the old museum dioramas allowed. The discovery and study of Neanderthal burials, the growing evidence for care of injured individuals, the refinement of Mousterian technology, and the reassessment of classic skeletons all helped soften the brutal stereotype. The hunched, shambling brute was increasingly recognized as a mistake, partly a product of pathology, partly a product of reconstruction, and partly a product of expectation. Neanderthals were no longer simply the failed ape men of Europe. They were large-brained, cold-adapted humans with complex survival strategies, deep knowledge of landscapes, and bodies that had endured hundreds of thousands of years across some of the hardest climates ever inhabited by the genus Homo. Then, the replacement model gave the stereotype a way back in. This is where the history becomes delicate, because out of Africa as a genetic and fossil framework was not created simply to demote Neanderthals. But as the model hardened into a popular story of one superior modern population replacing archaic populations across Eurasia, it often smuggled in an old hierarchy. Modern humans were the symbolic revolution. Modern humans were the artists. Modern humans were the talkers, planners, innovators, network builders, and social geniuses. Neanderthals became the foil, the dark mirror, the nearly human population that lacked some final spark. The more triumphant the replacement story became, the more Neanderthals were pushed back toward inferiority, not always by direct insult, but by implication. They did not have our brain shape. They did not have our behavior. They did not have our future. This is why the new paper matters so much. It does not merely say that Neanderthals were intelligent in some sentimental way. It attacks the technical basis for turning anatomical differences into cognitive rankings. The authors argue that previous claims about Neanderthal brain organization were often not placed in the context of normal modern human variation. That is a crucial phrase because without context, any difference can look dramatic. A Neanderthal brain region can be described as smaller or larger than a modern human equivalent, and the reader naturally imagines a sharp divide. But when the same difference is compared to the range found inside living Homo sapiens, the drama weakens. Suddenly, what looked like a species-level cognitive gap begins to look like a variation inside the broader human pattern. The comparison is therefore not a side note. It is the control that should have been obvious all along. Before claiming that Neanderthal brain anatomy made them cognitively different, researchers needed to ask how much living humans differ from one another in the same regions. If living populations can vary more than Neanderthals and early modern humans in most regions examined, then the inference of Neanderthal inferiority becomes scientifically unstable. It becomes less a conclusion than a habit. And this is precisely the kind of habit Holloway was warning about in 1985, when he suggested that Neanderthals had been made into primitive minds partly because people were determined to see primitive minds. The new paper does allow room for small differences. That matters because the strongest argument is not that there were no differences at all. Neanderthals were not simply modern Europeans in heavy coats. Their skulls were shaped differently, their faces grew differently. Their bodies were broader, more robust, more powerful, and adapted to different ecological demands. Their developmental patterns differed in some ways, and their brains followed slightly different growth trajectories after birth. Some earlier research, including work from the Max Planck Institute, has suggested that Neanderthal and modern human brains were very similar at birth, but developed differently in shape during infancy and childhood. Other researchers have argued that Neanderthals allocated more neural tissue to vision and body maintenance because of larger eyes, larger bodies, and high-latitude life. These are real hypotheses, and they should not be dismissed out of hand, but none of them automatically proves inferiority. Difference is not deficiency. That distinction has been violated again and again in human origins. A longer skull becomes an archaic mind. A larger nose becomes a primitive face. A thicker brow ridge becomes a lower intelligence. A robust skeleton becomes a savage personality. The old racial science of the 19th and early 20th centuries worked by exactly this kind of visual translation, turning anatomy into destiny, then destiny into hierarchy. Modern paleoanthropology has largely rejected that intellectual world, but fragments of it can survive inside respectable arguments when researchers treat anatomical difference as if it naturally points toward cognitive rank. Holloway saw that danger. He explicitly warned that modern archaeologists would never conclude that living hunter-gatherers lacked language, ritual, social complexity, or symbolic life merely because only stone tools remained. And yet, Neanderthals were often judged precisely that way, from the fragmentary survival of objects under Ice Age conditions. The archaeology has only made the old stereotype harder to defend. Neanderthals controlled fire, made sophisticated stone tools, hunted large dangerous animals, occupied caves and open-air sites, used pigments in some contexts, collected unusual objects, exploited marine resources in coastal regions, and cared for individuals who survived serious injuries. At places like Chanida, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and elsewhere, the debate over burial and mortuary behavior has remained complicated, but the broader picture is no longer compatible with a stupid or nearly speechless creature. Even where interpretations are disputed, the disputes are no longer between human and animal. They are between different kinds of human behavior, different thresholds of symbolism, different standards of evidence, and different archaeological preservation conditions. The Neanderthal has not become simple. The Neanderthal has become more difficult, more interesting, and harder to separate cleanly from us. Genetics has complicated the story even further. The old replacement model required clean boundaries, modern humans here, Neanderthals there, one species replacing another. But ancient DNA revealed mixture. Living non-African populations carry Neanderthal ancestry. Early Upper Paleolithic individuals sometimes carry recent Neanderthal ancestry in large chromosomal segments, meaning their Neanderthal ancestors lived only a few generations before them. The boundary was not absolute. These populations met, mated, produced children, and contributed to later people. Once that is admitted, the language of total replacement begins to weaken. Extinction becomes absorption. Difference becomes population structure. Neanderthals do not disappear as a failed intelligence wiped from the map by a superior mind. They become part of the ancestry of later humans, while their distinct morphology and local genetic identity are diluted, fragmented, and folded into expanding populations. That is why the new brain study's emphasis on demography and genetic swamping is so important. If Neanderthals vanished, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they were fewer in number, more isolated, more vulnerable to population collapse, and eventually absorbed into larger incoming networks, then the story changes completely. Their disappearance no longer requires a mental defect. It requires only the brutal arithmetic of population size. Small groups can be overwhelmed by larger groups, even when they are equally intelligent. A lineage can vanish as a visible fossil population while surviving genetically in descendants. A population can lose their distinctiveness not because they were incapable, but because history, climate, numbers, disease, mating networks, and social geography moved against them. In that sense, the new paper does not merely defend Neanderthals. It exposes the weakness of a whole narrative architecture. For years, the public was told that the mystery of Neanderthal extinction had to be solved by finding what they lacked. They lacked art. They lacked language. They lacked planning. They lacked imagination. They lacked the modern human brain. But every decade has removed another stone from that structure. Their tools were more sophisticated than once believed. Their diets were more varied. Their symbolic behavior was more plausible. Their bodies were not malformed brutes, but powerful human bodies adapted to Ice Age Eurasia. Their genes did not vanish but entered us. And now the supposed brain gap, one of the last refuges of the superiority story, looks far smaller when placed beside normal variation among living humans. This does not mean that every claim about Neanderthal cognition should be accepted uncritically. It does not mean Neanderthals were exactly the same as early modern humans in every respect. It does not mean their societies were identical, their population networks equally large, or their symbolic traditions equally visible in the archaeological record. There may have been real differences in social scale, innovation rate, exchange networks, childhood learning, mobility, vocal culture, or ecological flexibility. But those differences do not require a biological hierarchy of minds. They reflect demography more than anatomy. They reflect geography more than intelligence. They reflect the difference between small, scattered populations and larger, more connected populations moving through expanding networks across Western Eurasia. In human history, numbers can look like genius after the fact. That is the deeper lesson Holloway was pointing toward. He was not asking us to romanticize Neanderthals. He was asking us to stop using them as a screen for our own assumptions. His 1985 paper reads today almost like a warning left in a drawer. A warning that the science of ancient brains could become a mirror in which modern researchers saw whatever they wanted to see. If they expected primitives, they would find primitive sulci. If they expected poor language, they would find poor frontal lobes. If they expected inferior cognition, they would find it in the slope of the skull, the position of the occipital lobe, the width of the face, or the absence of some modern-looking curve. But the evidence itself was more ambiguous, more resistant, and more human than the story built around it. The irony is that the newest research now sounds like an echo of Holloway's older argument. Neanderthal brains were not obviously poor brains. They were not small brains. They were not simple brains. They were not the brains of failed animals waiting to be replaced by a superior species. They belonged to a population of humans that survived for hundreds of thousands of years, endured glacial Europe, hunted enormous animals, raised children in dangerous landscapes, buried or at least cared deeply for some of their dead, and left enough of their DNA that replacement can no longer be drawn with a clean line. The real mystery is not whether Neanderthals had minds. The real mystery is why so many modern people needed them not to. And perhaps that is where the story should end, not with certainty, but with suspicion towards certainty itself. The Neanderthal skull still looks back at us with its long vault, its heavy brow, its wide face, and its enormous nose, and it still invites interpretation. But we now know how dangerous that invitation can be. A face is not a mind, a skull is not a destiny, a fossil is not a moral ranking. For more than a century, Neanderthals were made to carry the burden of our categories: primitive and modern, African and European, human and not quite human, winner and loser, superior and inferior. But the more evidence we recover, the more those categories begin to crack. The poor brain of Neanderthal was never poor at all. It was our imagination that was impoverished, our model that was too narrow, and our need for a clean replacement story that made one branch of humanity look less human than it really was. And with that statement, we leave you to ponder the mysteries of our shared human history. Until next time, stay curious and stay questioning. Also, please subscribe, share, and explore our channel's other videos. Thank you and take care.